The land known today as Israel and Palestine has been a home to countless generations, but its modern history is marked by displacement, conflict, and unfulfilled promises. Over the last century, the Palestinian people have faced a series of events that stripped them of their homes, their land, and their sovereignty, while foreign powers imposed political agendas that continue to shape the region. Understanding this history is crucial because the roots of today's conflict are not recent. They are decades deep, tied to the colonization of Palestine, the creation of Israel, and the systematic displacement of its people. This video takes you through that history. We will explore how Palestinian towns were uprooted, how entire communities were forced to flee, and how successive wars, settlements, and occupation policies have impacted generations. By the end, you will see the story of Palestine not as a political debate, but as a human history, one of displacement, resistance, and the struggle to remain on the land their ancestors lived on for centuries. Before the 20th century, the area now called Israel and Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire for over 400 years. Under Ottoman rule, Palestine was largely an Arab land with a small Jewish minority. The majority of the population lived in towns and villages across the regions of Gaza, Jerusalem, Hebron, Nablus, and Jaffa. The people were predominantly Muslim, with Christian and Jewish communities coexisting alongside them. Agriculture was the backbone of life, with olive groves, citrus orchards, and wheat fields defining the economy. Local governance, under Ottoman officials, allowed communities a degree of autonomy, and daily life was centered around family, religion, and land. This era saw a relatively stable society, where Palestinians managed their own lives, cultivated their land, and maintained their cultural and religious traditions. While Jews lived in Palestine, the numbers were small, and they did not dominate the demographic or political landscape. There was no Jewish state and no mass displacement. Most of the people who lived there were Palestinians by ancestry and tradition. Towards the late 19th century, European Zionist movements began promoting the idea of creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Some Jewish immigrants began arriving, purchasing land from absentee Ottoman landlords, often displacing small Palestinian farmers. While these early settlements were minor in scale, they planted the seeds of tension, as Palestinian villagers increasingly faced losing their land and livelihoods to outsiders whose goal was to establish a separate national entity. This period is important because it shows Palestine as it existed before major colonial interference. A land of Palestinians, where their communities had roots stretching back centuries. Any subsequent political developments occurred on this foundation, making it essential to understand that Palestinians were the indigenous population, living and working on their land long before the creation of Israel. The First World War ended Ottoman control over Palestine. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, promising support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This declaration ignored the political rights and wishes of the Palestinian Arabs, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population. Palestinians had lived on the land for generations, yet their consent was never sought, their sovereignty never considered. During the British Mandate, 1920 to 1948, tensions between Jewish settlers and Palestinian Arabs escalated. The British encouraged Jewish immigration while promising to protect Palestinian rights, but in practice, the balance heavily favored the new settlers. Jewish immigration surged, particularly in the 1930s as Jews fled Nazi persecution in Europe. Palestinian Arabs watched as their land was increasingly purchased and controlled by foreign settlers. Farmers were evicted, and villages saw their territories shrink. Resistance began early. Palestinians organized revolts in 1920, 1921, and 1936 to 1939, calling for the end of British policies favoring Zionism and opposing further Jewish immigration. These revolts were met with harsh military crackdowns. Thousands of Palestinians were killed or imprisoned, while their political leadership was weakened. The British often suppressed Palestinian protests while supporting Jewish settlements, deepening the imbalance of power. By the mid-1940s, the tension had reached a breaking point. The idea of partitioning Palestine into Jewish and Arab states was proposed by the United Nations, but Palestinians were largely excluded from meaningful negotiation. The seeds for the 1948 Nakba, the mass expulsion and displacement of Palestinians, were already sown. The British Mandate era demonstrates how foreign intervention, coupled with organized migration supported by colonial powers, disrupted centuries of Palestinian life. What had been a stable society under Ottoman rule became a land in turmoil, with Palestinian communities facing land loss, economic hardship, and the beginnings of political marginalization. By the mid-1940s, Palestine was on the brink of irreversible change. Decades of foreign intervention, combined with waves of Jewish immigration encouraged by the British, had already disrupted centuries of Palestinian life. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a plan to partition Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab. The plan allocated approximately 55% of the land to the Jewish state and 45% to the Arab state. This decision disregarded the reality on the ground. Palestinians made up roughly two-thirds of the population and owned the vast majority of the land. The allocation disproportionately favored Jewish immigrants, many of whom had arrived only recently, while Palestinians were given fragmented, less fertile territory. Palestinian leaders rejected the UN Partition Plan outright. They viewed it as an unjust imposition by foreign powers that denied them sovereignty over their ancestral land. The plan did not reflect the demographic, cultural, or historical realities of the region. Palestinians warned that any attempt to enforce this plan would provoke conflict, yet the international community largely ignored their objections. Almost immediately after the UN vote, violence erupted. Jewish paramilitary groups such as the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi began operations to secure land designated for the Jewish state. Attacks on Palestinian villages escalated tensions, resulting in deaths, destruction of homes, and the forced flight of civilians. On May 14, 1948, Israel declared independence. Within hours, neighboring Arab states, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, entered the territory, ostensibly to support the Palestinian population. Yet despite the involvement of these forces, the outcome was catastrophic for Palestinians. By the end of the conflict, over 700,000 Palestinians had been expelled or had fled from their homes. Hundreds of Palestinian villages were depopulated and, in many cases, deliberately destroyed to prevent the return of residents. Cities like Haifa, Jaffa, and Lydda saw mass displacement, while families who had lived on the land for generations were forced into refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the Gaza Strip. This event, known as the Nakba, or catastrophe, became a defining moment in Palestinian history, marking the beginning of a long-standing struggle over land, identity, and sovereignty. The refugee crisis created by the 1948 war had immediate and long-term consequences. Camps were established across the Middle East to accommodate displaced Palestinians, but conditions were harsh. Access to food, clean water, healthcare, and employment was limited. Generations of Palestinians were born and raised in these camps, often under precarious and crowded conditions. The right of return, enshrined in UN Resolution 194, called for refugees to be allowed to return to their homes and receive compensation if they chose not to. However, this resolution was never fully implemented. Israel refused to permit the return of refugees, citing security concerns and the need to maintain a Jewish majority within its borders. As a result, millions of Palestinians remained stateless, with their hopes of returning to their ancestral homes deferred indefinitely. During the years following 1948, Israel expanded its control beyond the boundaries proposed in the UN Partition Plan. Armistice agreements in 1949 formalized the so-called Green Line, but no Palestinian state was established. This left Palestinians without political representation or autonomy in their homeland. In response to their displacement and the continuing occupation of their land, Palestinian national consciousness and political organization began to consolidate. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was founded to unite Palestinians and advocate for their right to self-determination. The organization became the primary voice for Palestinians in exile, combining political, diplomatic, and, at times, armed resistance to challenge Israel's control over historic Palestine. Throughout this period, regional tensions intensified. Israel's existence and expansion created ongoing friction with its Arab neighbors, who saw the Palestinian issue as central to regional stability and justice. Sporadic clashes along the borders, cross-border raids, and retaliatory attacks became increasingly common. The Palestinian population, both within the remaining territories and in refugee camps, faced restrictions on movement, economic hardship, and the persistent threat of military aggression. The broader Arab-Israeli conflict was inseparable from the Palestinian plight, but for the refugees and the communities under Israeli control, the consequences were immediate and devastating. In June 1967, the region experienced another dramatic shift with the outbreak of the Six-Day War. Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, claiming it was responding to escalating threats. Within 6 days, Israel captured the West Bank from Jordan, the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. For Palestinians, this was a moment of further displacement and occupation. Tens of thousands more Palestinians were uprooted from the West Bank and Gaza, joining the growing ranks of refugees. Israeli control over East Jerusalem brought additional restrictions, as Palestinians lost access to significant portions of their historical, cultural, and religious heritage. The consequences of the Six-Day War reshaped the political and demographic landscape. Israel began establishing settlements in the newly occupied territories, creating a system of control that restricted Palestinian movement, limited economic opportunities, and imposed military governance. The occupation entrenched inequality and furthered the dispossession of Palestinians from their land. Palestinian resistance, both organized and grassroots, began to intensify, setting the stage for future uprisings and ongoing political struggle. International law considers the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem as occupied territories, and the establishment of settlements is widely regarded as illegal under these statutes, though enforcement has been limited. By the end of this period, the Palestinian people had endured decades of displacement, dispossession, and marginalization. The combination of the UN Partition Plan, the 1948 war, the resulting refugee crisis, ongoing regional tensions, and the Six-Day War created a landscape in which Palestinians were largely denied sovereignty, autonomy, and the ability to live safely on the land of their ancestors. The international community's failure to enforce resolutions and uphold Palestinian rights contributed to a cycle of occupation, settlement, and resistance that continues into the present day. This era of Palestinian history is defined by loss and resilience. Despite the displacement and political marginalization, Palestinians maintained their cultural identity, traditions, and connection to the land. Refugee camps became centers of social, political, and cultural organization, while the PLO and other groups worked to assert Palestinian claims internationally. The events between 1947 and 1967 laid the groundwork for the ongoing struggle, highlighting the stark contrast between international promises and the lived reality of the Palestinian people. Understanding this period is essential to grasping the historical roots of the modern conflict and the enduring Palestinian demand for justice, recognition, and the right to return to their homeland. After the Six-Day War in 1967, the Palestinian people found themselves living under a new, harsher reality. The occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem brought widespread restrictions on movement, limitations on economic activity, and the gradual expansion of Israeli settlements on Palestinian land. In response to these conditions, Palestinian political and armed movements gained momentum, aiming to assert national rights, resist occupation, and restore the possibility of sovereignty. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, established in 1964, became the primary vehicle for Palestinian resistance. Initially, the PLO combined both political diplomacy and armed struggle, seeking to bring global attention to the plight of Palestinians. Leaders like Yasser Arafat emphasized unity among Palestinians in exile and within the occupied territories. Over the 1970s and early 1980s, the PLO carried out operations aimed at confronting Israeli control, drawing both support and controversy on the international stage. However, much of the Palestinian population in the occupied territories faced daily hardships, including curfews, military raids, property confiscation, and limited access to essential services. By the late 1980s, frustration with ongoing occupation and the failure of diplomatic initiatives led to a grassroots uprising, the First Intifada. Beginning in 1987, this mass mobilization of Palestinians across the West Bank and Gaza involved boycotts, protests, strikes, and civil disobedience. It was fueled not only by political goals, but also by the desire for basic human dignity, freedom from military oppression, and the ability to live on ancestral land without fear of displacement. The Intifada drew international attention to the plight of Palestinians, highlighting the stark contrast between their daily struggles and Israel's military and political dominance. During this period, thousands of Palestinians were killed or injured. Yet, the resistance demonstrated the resilience of a people determined to maintain their identity and demand justice. The momentum of the First Intifada eventually led to the Oslo Accords in 1993, a landmark attempt at negotiating peace between Israelis and Palestinians. The Accords established the Palestinian Authority, PA, granting limited self-governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. While the agreements were presented as a step toward a two-state solution, the reality on the ground was more complex. Israel continued to expand settlements in the West Bank, maintain checkpoints, and control key resources, undermining the autonomy promised to Palestinians. The Oslo process also failed to address the most fundamental issues: the right of return for refugees, the status of East Jerusalem, and the recognition of Palestinian sovereignty over all of historic Palestine. The peace process faltered in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Frustration and continued occupation led to the Second Intifada, 2000 to 2005, marked by widespread violence, increased military operations, and significant civilian casualties on both sides. Palestinians faced strict curfews, movement restrictions, home demolitions, and economic hardship, while hope for a negotiated solution diminished. The failure of the peace process reinforced a sense of injustice and urgency among Palestinians, solidifying the ongoing struggle for recognition and rights. Today, the Palestinian territories remain divided and constrained. The West Bank is under partial control of the Palestinian Authority, yet Israeli settlements continue to expand, fragmenting the land and restricting movement through checkpoints and security barriers. Gaza, on the other hand, is controlled by Hamas and has been subjected to a blockade for years, severely limiting access to food, medical care, and economic opportunities. Residents of both territories live under constant pressure, navigating a reality shaped by occupation, restricted sovereignty, and humanitarian challenges. Despite these conditions, Palestinians continue to resist culturally, politically, and socially, preserving their heritage and advocating for their rights on the international stage. The combination of limited self-governance, ongoing occupation, and humanitarian crises has created a complex and enduring situation. Palestinians in the West Bank face daily challenges imposed by checkpoints, roadblocks, and military authority, while those in Gaza contend with electricity shortages, restricted access to clean water, and limited opportunities for employment and education. These conditions perpetuate economic dependency and social strain, making the struggle for political recognition and statehood even more urgent. International organizations and human rights groups have repeatedly highlighted violations of Palestinian rights, yet progress toward a lasting resolution remains stalled. Through decades of occupation, displacement, and international neglect, Palestinians have maintained their identity, culture, and connection to the land. Refugee camps established after the Nakba remain vibrant centers of community and political organization, ensuring that the memory of lost homes and the demand for return persist across generations. Organizations like the PLO, as well as local grassroots movements, continue to advocate for Palestinian self-determination, while global awareness and solidarity campaigns amplify their cause. This period of Palestinian history demonstrates the resilience of a people determined to survive and resist despite immense challenges. From organized liberation movements to popular uprisings, and from limited governance under the Oslo framework to the realities of life under occupation in Gaza and the West Bank, the story of Palestinians is one of enduring struggle. It underscores the ongoing need for recognition, justice, and respect for the rights of the Palestinian people, whose history and experiences have been shaped by decades of displacement, conflict, and contested sovereignty. International law has long recognized the rights of Palestinians, yet enforcement has often been lacking. UN Resolution 194, passed in 1948, affirms the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and receive compensation if they choose not to return. Despite this, Israel has consistently refused to allow refugees to return, leaving millions stateless and confined to camps with limited resources. The Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits the transfer of an occupying power's population into occupied territories and protects civilians under occupation, yet Israeli settlements continue to expand across the West Bank, often on confiscated Palestinian land, restricting movement and access to resources. Human rights organizations have documented the daily challenges faced by Palestinians. Checkpoints, home demolitions, restricted access to water and electricity, and limited freedom of movement are common. In Gaza, a blockade has created a humanitarian crisis, limiting food, medical supplies, and economic opportunities. Palestinians face systemic obstacles to self-determination, with the Palestinian Authority exercising limited control in parts of the West Bank and Gaza remaining under Hamas governance. Despite international recognition by over 130 countries and ongoing advocacy, fundamental rights remain unfulfilled. The Palestinian history, from Ottoman rule to British mandate, the 1948 Nakba, occupation and uprisings, illustrates decades of displacement and resistance. Refugees remain in camps, settlements fragment Palestinian land, and occupation restricts autonomy, yet Palestinians maintain their cultural identity, heritage, and political organization. Their struggle is rooted in both survival and the pursuit of justice, sovereignty, and the right to return to ancestral lands. Understanding this history is essential to comprehending the modern conflict. It is not only a political dispute, but a story of human displacement and resilience. The path to justice requires recognition of international law, enforcement of UN resolutions, and respect for Palestinian rights. Acknowledging their historical presence and enduring struggle is central to any fair resolution. In conclusion, the story of Palestine is one of resilience in the face of displacement, occupation, and systemic restrictions. Despite hardships, Palestinians have preserved their identity, maintained their connection to the land, and continued to advocate for their rights. Their history underscores the need for justice, recognition, and the fulfillment of rights long denied. The Palestinian struggle is not just historical. It continues today, reflecting both the injustices of the past and the enduring human spirit determined to survive, resist, and reclaim what was lost.